The horror of the worst space accident in history. Good evening. The tragic destruction of the Space Shuttle Challenger, as millions throughout the United States watched on live television, dominates this edition of Eyewitness News.
The relatives of the 7 crew members who perished in the fireball watched the drama evolve from the special NASA viewing area at Cape Canaveral.
This mission has attracted special interest because of the inclusion of a teacher in the crew. But well before the flight, a young girl had made her views on a mum in space quite clear.
Well, because I don't want to go in space, because I just want to stay around my house.
Young Caroline McAuliffe may not have been able to express her worst fears, but 1 minute and 15 seconds after liftoff, they all came true with horrifying finality.
9 nautical miles above the launch pad, the shuttle crew received the go-ahead from ground control to push the throttles fully open.
Already under enormous acceleration, it was a split second after this command, the Challenger, its huge fuel tank and the 2 booster rockets blew themselves and their 7 crew apart.
Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now to 104%. Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles. Looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
The people of Christa McAuliffe's New Hampshire hometown weren't surprised that she was selected to be the first teacher in space.
Her family joined the celebrations when she was selected.
And tragically, they were there at Cape Canaveral to see the shuttle blasted out of the sky.
But it's likely to take some time for the death of this new local hero to hit home.
One of the things that I would like to do when I go aboard the shuttle is to bring back the wonder of it all.
Those were Christa McAuliffe's words when she was introduced to the press last July 1st as one of the 10 finalists in the Teacher in Space program. She was one of more than 11,000 teachers who'd applied for the honor. She told NASA she wanted to demystify spaceflight and to humanize the technology of the space age.
And the winner, the teacher who will be going into space, Christa McAuliffe. Is that you?
Less than 3 weeks later, this then 36-year-old high school social studies teacher was tapped to become the first average citizen in space. It was an emotional moment.
When that shuttle goes, there might be one body. But there's going to be 10 souls that I'm taking with me. Thank you.
That's great.
Her husband, Steve, and 9-year-old son, Scott, and 6-year-old daughter, Carolyn, received the news with understandable pride.
So, Scott, how do you feel about your mother flying in space?
I feel real excited about it. Well, because I don't want to go in space, because I just want to stay around my house.
But beyond the hoopla of being an instant celebrity, McAuliffe was faced with the demands of being an astronaut in training. Despite a few joking complaints about the close quarters on the shuttle, she said it was like putting 6 people in a pup tent. She clearly relished the challenge. She also devoted a great deal of time to what were to have been 2 live televised lessons from space. The first of those, which was to have given school children around the country a glimpse of daily shuttle life, had been billed as the ultimate field trip. In an interview shortly before her tragic death, McAuliffe reflected on what she was doing. She said she hoped to inspire others to reach out and try new and different things.
If that message can get back to kids and to anybody, that, to go for it, to go ahead and push for something, maybe that you don't know whether you're going to attain it. I had no idea I was ever going to be chosen, but I felt good because I reached out for that.
As well as Christa McAuliffe, 2 other crew members were making their first space flight.
But the 4 other members of the Challenger crew were NASA veterans with a wealth of experience in space.
The crew members included 3 trained pilots, a laser expert, the second woman to fly in space, a Hughes aircraft engineer, and Christa McAuliffe, the woman who was to have been the first teacher in space. Challenger's pilot was 40-year-old Michael Smith. He flew missions in Vietnam and was awarded the Navy's Distinguished Flying Cross. He said flying was a dream he had since childhood.
As far back as I can remember, all I ever wanted to do was fly.
The flight was commanded by 46-year-old Francis Dick Scobie. The Challenger flight was going to be his second trip aboard the space shuttle. Scobie was a test pilot with the Air Force. He entered the space program in 1979, and he believed Christa McAuliffe would serve as an important role model for younger Americans.
The lasting part is going to be the idea that she puts in the head of both teachers and students to expect to be in space. In other words, their future, space is part of their future. They expect to live and work there. And if she can do that, she's doing a lot for mankind.
Mission specialist Ellison Onizuka was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. He was a member of the crew of the Defense Department's first super-secret shuttle flight.
I think that there is a need for, what we did on our first mission, and I fully believe that it's something that this country needed, the rest of the free world needed it.
Dr. Judy Resnick was a biomedical engineer before joining the space program in 1978. Payload specialist Gregory Jarvis was an electrical engineer who joined the program only 2 years ago. He talked about the space vehicle.
Well, it's been very satisfying because you are close to the space. You don't get to do the ultimate trip, but you're close enough to the program that you really feel like you're contributing, and you bring your friends in to see the spacecraft, and they look at it, and you say, gee, I wonder, maybe it is something special, because I spent all my life around it, so it becomes very mundane to me.
Finally, 36-year-old mission specialist Ronald McNair was a physicist. He became an astronaut in 1978 following work at the Hughes Research Laboratories. McNair planned to track Halley's Comet during the Challenger mission. McNair was the second black astronaut to fly in space.
President Reagan was informed of the disaster within seconds of the explosion which ripped Challenger apart.
He cancelled his scheduled State of the Union address, instead taking time to speak to the nation and put into words the horror everyone felt.
Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. We mourn their loss as a nation together. To the families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God.
Now we cross live to our New York correspondent, John Wiseman, who has flown to Cape Canaveral to cover the latest developments. John, just what is the feeling at the Cape now?
Well, David, the gloom and disbelief continues here through tonight. It was only a few hours ago that the staff went home from the Kennedy Space Center. Control room staff apparently stayed on doing their job mechanically through the day until Vice President Bush asked them to go home, spoke to them and asked them to go home late tonight. It's the early hours of the morning now and the centre has shut down. Everybody's gone home and they're going to return early in the morning to work out where they go from here.
John, has there been any announcement about how long the investigation is likely to take?
Joe, the only indication here, everybody is talking in terms of months and months and months, possibly the end of the year. They're going to have to look at everything in minute detail, and where do they start? Debris is everywhere. Their computers apparently told them nothing was wrong moments before the explosion happened. The only concrete things they've got to go on are some videotapes, which we've all seen through the day, and some audio recordings, so they're going to have to go through those minutely. What it will tell them, we don't know.
I guess they've pounced on those bits of debris they've been able to collect, John. Are there any clues tonight as to what happened, or is there a clampdown on any speculation at all?
Well, from NASA, David, the word is we will not speculate on this tragedy. We will say nothing until we've got something to say. So the short answer is there's nothing definite. There are no clues. What we have are a score of theories.
John, as you've said, there were no clues, and it may be far-fetched, but in these times of international terrorism, the question of sabotage has been raised. Now, is there any official talk of that in the States tonight?
Nothing officially that I've heard at all, Joe, but it is something they obviously would have to consider in any investigation of something going wrong with the shuttle. As we've seen from the videotape today, the slow motion particularly, we saw flames licking up the booster rocket between it and the shuttle. So something caused that. Could it be sabotage? That's one thing they'd have to look at. There are two main theories at the moment. One, that the booster rocket could have in fact been damaged. There's some suggestion that it could have been damaged last Saturday, although NASA says to its knowledge it wasn't. And there's another one about the weather. It was unusually cold here in Florida last night, so cold it left ice on some parts of the pad. And there's questions now, could that have damaged this rocket in some way?
We may have to wait months to find out. Thank you very much, John. John Wiseman, live from Cape Canaveral.
And close examination, frame by frame, of videotapes may be the best chance at this stage of indicating the cause of the explosion. We do that in a moment.
And we report on the implications for Australia's AUSSAT satellite project when this special edition of Eyewitness News continues. Officials are tonight closely examining all available data as the long and involved investigation into the accident begins.
Some of that evidence is contained in the television pictures of the explosion. Here now, frame by frame, are the final few seconds before the disaster, and from CNN reporter Don Lennox, one theory as to what happened.
Video showed the explosion of Challenger in excruciating detail, but it did not initially reveal the cause. The explosion came a little more than a minute after launch at a point where one of the shuttle's two solid rocket boosters attached to the shuttle. While NASA has videotapes and still photographs of the disaster, Associate Administrator Jesse Moore says more evidence will be gathered.
Data from all of the shuttle instrumentation, photographs, launch pad systems, hardware, cargo, ground support systems, and even notes made by any member of the launch team and flight ops team are being impounded for study. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy.
The first visible sign of a problem was the explosion itself, but slow-motion replays of the final seconds of flight show what appears to be a fire near the lower end of one of the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. Moments later, a second fire seems to be visible between Challenger and its volatile external fuel tank. A fuel line from that tank to the shuttle to power its three main engines runs along the underside of the space shuttle. Less than a second after the fire appeared, it seemed to trigger a huge fireball that enveloped the entire shuttle. All that remained were two solid rocket boosters careening out of control.
The Challenger tragedy will have wide-ranging ramifications for Australia's involvement in space. Both the Australian in Space and AUSAT projects will be seriously affected by the disaster.
Nick McAuliffe reports on Canberra's reaction to the tragedy.
At the American Embassy in Canberra, flags flew at half-mast, and tomorrow American Ambassador Bill Lane will pay further tribute to the 7 astronauts at Tidbinbilla Deep Space Centre near Canberra. Although not involved in this particular flight, Tidbinbilla has been the shuttle program's major tracking centre outside the United States. The Challenger tragedy will directly affect Australia. Next year, an Australian astronaut is due to fly in a shuttle mission, a mission now almost certain to be delayed. The government will start screening applicants for that job next month. Science Minister Barry Jones said there had been a lot of interest, but anticipates those less serious will now drop out.
But I think the people who are really very dedicated would say these are risks that we've always taken into account. And I think they'd also take the view that there's a fair prospect that the next space shuttles that go up after this tragedy are likely to be safer, perhaps, than some of the earlier ones.
The tragedy will also affect AUSAT, Australia's satellite program. Although the third AUSAT satellite will be launched this year from a French rocket, its insurance premiums are expected to rise by millions of dollars. It's believed AUSAT already spends around $12 million per satellite for insurance. The Prime Minister today sent a message of sympathy to President Reagan, saying Australians had for a long time admired the expertise and courage of America's space pioneers. Nick McAuliffe, Eyewitness News, Canberra.
And 10 Melbourne people who've booked on the first commercial space flights in 1992 have so far not shown any signs of thinking again.
Each passenger has paid $5,200 for the flight on a futuristic spacecraft still being developed, which is claimed to be safer than the present shuttlecraft.
For this reason, the organisers don't expect cancellations from those who've paid for the trip of a lifetime.
In line with President Reagan's encouragement for private enterprise to participate in space, an American company, Society Expeditions, is offering space flights for fare-paying passengers, and the timetable for the first flight, nearly 7 years away, has been confidently drawn up. The passengers won't be travelling on a shuttle perched on a flying fuel tank which catapults the vehicle violently into space, but on a new technology, vertical takeoff self-contained spacecraft, named the Phoenix E. Seats on the flights, which will take 20 passengers at a time, have attracted worldwide interest, and it's claimed the deposits of $5,200 have been pouring in. It's also claimed the Phoenix E will be technologically years ahead of the shuttlecraft now operating. According to the travel agents who handle Society Expeditions business here in Australia, none of the 10 people in Melbourne who've already paid their deposit for a 1992 flight on the Phoenix E have asked for their money back. In fact, according to the manager of the travel company, the only inquiries in the wake of the USA disaster have been from the media. Jim Brown, Eyewitness News.
It's 19 years since an American space mission ended in tragedy, and the combined Soviet and American space program death toll stood at 7 prior to today's disaster. We'll trace the history of man's bid to conquer space later in this special edition of Eyewitness News.
But next, tragedy for the Australian Air Force today with the crash of a supersonic F-111 off Jervis Bay. Search continues off the New South Wales south coast today for the bodies of an Australian Air Force pilot and his American navigator, believed killed when their F-111 crashed last night, 80 kilometres east of Montague Island. Sean Flannery reports the missing men are 24-year-old Flight Lieutenant Stephen Erskine of Mansfield, Queensland, and 34-year-old Exchange Officer Captain Gregory Angle.
It was about 9:30 at night when the aircraft, on a routine exercise, disappeared on its second run of simulated attack.
HMAS Hobart and Sydney and Parramatta were operating up in this area. And they spotted a flare or a fireball in this area, and also HMAS Geelong down here, approximately the same time, spotted what they believed to be a flare or a fireball.
How was the Mayday received?
Mayday was relayed from his wingman.
The remaining F-111s made an initial search, and soon after, Navy ships, helicopters, RAAF Hercules and a New Zealand Air Force Orion were on the scene. Wreckage was found just after first light. Then, later in the day, pieces of clothing and aircrew equipment were dragged from the water. All has been placed on board HMAS Hobart for later examination.
All we can presume with any confidence is what the evidence would show, that the aircraft impacted the water, and that is consistent with a fireball that was seen.
But what could be the cause?
A catastrophic malfunction, or that the aircraft was flown into the water. It does not look good. It looks anything but good.
2 young teenage boys were killed at Clayton this morning when they rode a trail bike into the path of a passenger train. According to police, the boys were riding the bike along the bank next to the railway line, then suddenly accelerated across the track as they neared a level crossing. Killed were 14-year-old Kyriakos Dubos of Clayton, who was riding the bike, and 15-year-old Basilion Athanasoulian, also of Clayton, who was riding as pillion. Kevin Hitchcock reports.
Details of the accident are still sketchy, but according to witnesses, the bike was on the edge of the crossing when struck by the oncoming train at about 10:30 a.m. The leading carriage stopped some 200 metres past the crossing, the mangled remains of the bike still trapped beneath its wheels. The 2 boys were killed instantly by the impact of the train, which carried them almost 100 metres down the track. Local police sealed off the area and kept distraught relatives and friends away from the scene as ambulance crews arrived to retrieve the bodies. Passengers on the Dandenong to Melbourne train were also asked to remain clear until the accident victims had been removed. Later, they were allowed to disembark and seek alternative transport when it was realised the line would be out of service for at least 2 hours. Kevin Hitchcock, Eyewitness News.
4 Parkville residents who unsuccessfully tried to stop ex-footballer Doug Wade from building extensions to his house now face the prospect of losing their own homes because the residents, all Doug Wade's neighbours, haven't paid him more than $100,000 awarded by the Court of Appeal. The Supreme Court Sheriff has stepped in and put their homes on the market. As they wonder where they'll get the money, Jim Brown reports the residents blame the Melbourne City Council for their problems.
This advertisement in last week's newspaper marked a new turn in the long-running Doug Wade house alterations dispute. 4 years ago, Doug Wade was given a permit by the Melbourne City Council to make these alterations to the rear of his house. 4 local residents objected and tried unsuccessfully to prevent construction. They took their case to the Supreme Court and lost, and appealed and lost, and had costs ordered against them. The total legal bill was $750,000, of which $102,000 was awarded to Doug Wade. They haven't paid, so Doug Wade put the Supreme Court Sheriff onto them. The Sheriff has now advertised the residents' homes for sale by auction. Doug Wade claims even if they do pay, he'll still be $150,000 out of pocket after winning a fight he didn't start.
They charged me with misrepresentation and fraud. They lost against me and they lose all their costs. I mean, they should pay me up. They should pay up and the quicker the better.
The case was bitterly fought and will be talked about for a long time. A book on the long-running battle has just been written which looks at the rights of people trying to protect their environment. One of the losers, Peter Thorne, who now has to find $25,000 in a hurry or lose his home, disputes Doug Wade's claim the residents knew what they were letting themselves in for.
Sometimes I just feel one's walking in a nightmare and that one day one will blink and wake up and the wall and the costs and everything else will go away, but it's not going to happen.
Possibly the saddest thing about the Wade affair is that 2 sides went to the courts looking for justice, and after all these years, neither side is happy. The only ones who've done well out of the battle are the lawyers. Jim Brown, Eyewitness News.
The US-Soviet race for space supremacy, President Reagan's Star Wars strategy, and even Australia's AUSAT satellite program.
They all began with man's earliest attempts to conquer the heavens. After this break in Eyewitness News, we'll take a special look at our attempts to reach for the stars and beyond, and the pressures which contributed to today's tragedy over the Atlantic.
Shuttles are only the latest chapter in the space race.
There have been tragedies before, but for the Americans, the lives lost today were the first in flight.
It's almost 19 years to the day since 3 astronauts died when their Apollo capsule exploded on the launch pad.
The space race began in earnest after World War II. Both the United States and the Soviet Union perfected rockets and missiles. The next goal? To develop a spacecraft that could fly humans into space. The Soviets won that race, just barely, when they launched cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into a single orbit of the Earth in April of 1961. The U.S. launched their manned space program the next month when Mercury blasted off the launch pad. Alan Shepard was the first American to make the trip out of the Earth's atmosphere, but he didn't make a full orbit of the Earth. That honor went to John Glenn, now a U.S. Senator, in February of 1962. From the beginning, the space program was more than a scientific experiment. It was a matter of national pride and national security.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
But the road to the moon was a rocky one. In 1967, the first Apollo flight was set to go. Its 3 astronauts suited up for a test run. But tragedy struck when a fire broke out inside the spacecraft cabin. All 3 lost their lives. It was the first, and until now, the last fatalities in the U.S. space program. But NASA pressed on to the moon. And 5 Apollo flights later, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin landed their lunar module on the moon while Michael Collins circled in the main spacecraft. Armstrong was the first to step onto the surface.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
NASA landed crews on the moon 5 more times. With the U.S. clearly on top in the space race, NASA let military considerations take a back seat for a while and concentrated on science. Skylab, the first U.S. space station, was launched in 1973. 3 crews of 3 astronauts each lived and worked aboard Skylab for a total of 171 days. Secure in their superiority, the U.S. agreed to a joint space mission with the Soviet Union, the Apollo-Soyuz test project. 3 American astronauts and 2 Soviet cosmonauts met in mid-orbit and remained linked for 2 days to conduct astronomical, medical, and technical experiments. But now, Congress wanted a return on their space investment. Billions of dollars had been poured into NASA coffers, so the Space Shuttle program was designed as a money-making venture. Business needed the shuttle to launch an increasing number of lucrative satellites. The military wanted the shuttle because of its growing research into space surveillance and later, space weapons. The 70s found NASA researchers back at the drawing board, working almost non-stop to develop this space vehicle that could be launched into space and returned much like an airplane. On November 24th, 1980, the first space shuttle rolled out of the hangar. Its name, Columbia. It marked a new era in space exploration. 6 months later, Columbia made its first trip into space. The flight lasted just over 54 hours. Since then, 3 other shuttlecrafts have been built: Challenger, Discovery, and Atlantis. With each flight, NASA became more proficient in launching satellites and looked to the future with the construction of a huge robot arm that can lift heavy loads in mid-orbit. NASA's next project, building the first permanent space station by the early 1990s. At least, that was the plan before Challenger's tragedy.
Coming up next in Eyewitness News, a man drowns at Black Rock, and we'll look at a tragedy of long ago which has just come to light.
Salvage experts have recovered a 200-year-old treasure trove from a Dutch...